Preston Montgomery stood at his office window, watching the last workers stream from his textile mill into the October dusk. Gas lamps flickered to life along the street below, casting halos of yellow light against the gathering dark. He could see her there, walking with that quiet grace she carried like a second skin. Her sewing basket balanced on one hip. Rachel Brennan. For a year now, he'd been courting her. For a year, she'd been refusing him. Tonight had been no different. He'd brought her a silk scarf from Boston, fine enough to make any woman weep. She'd touched it gently, her seamstress fingers recognizing quality, then handed it back with those same words she always used. "You're very kind, Mr. Montgomery, but our worlds are too different. I wish you well." Preston turned from the window, his reflection ghosting in the darkened glass. He was 42 years old, owner of the largest textile operation in 3 counties. His mansion sat on the hill overlooking town, 12 rooms that echoed with emptiness. His wife had died of fever 5 years back, leaving him with 2 children who needed a mother's touch. What more could Rachel possibly want? He'd offered her everything: security, comfort, a place in society. His children adored her already. Young Emma lit up whenever Rachel visited, and even 12-year-old Jacob, usually suspicious of anyone trying to replace his mother, spoke of her with respect. "Papa." Emma's voice drifted up from the floor below. "Is Miss Rachel coming to supper?" Preston descended the stairs, his boots heavy on polished wood. Emma waited in the parlor, her needlework forgotten in her lap. She was 8 years old and still believed the world was kind. "Not tonight." "Sweet pea." "Did you ask her again?" "I did." "And she said no again." Preston nodded. Emma's face fell, but she rallied quickly, the way children do. "Maybe she needs more time." "Papa, Mom always said good things take patience." Jacob appeared in the doorway, tall for his age and serious beyond his years. "Miss Rachel has her own life. Emma, her own work. Maybe she doesn't want to give that up." The boy was sharp. Preston had built his fortune on reading markets and understanding leverage, but his son could read people in ways that sometimes unsettled him. "I'm not asking her to give up her work." Preston said, "Just to share a better life with us." "Is it better?" Jacob asked quietly. Preston studied his son, uncertain what the boy meant. Of course it was better. This mansion, with its imported carpets and crystal chandeliers, versus Rachel's small cottage at the edge of town. His position in society versus her work as a seamstress taking in piece jobs. The choice seemed obvious. Later that night, after the children slept, Preston stood at his bedroom window. Autumn leaves spiraled down from the maple trees lining his property. The wind carried a bite that promised winter. Somewhere across town, Rachel would be in her cottage, probably still sewing by lamplight. That oil lamp he'd seen through her window, warm and steady in hers. He'd try again. Preston decided, perhaps a grander gesture, a piece of jewelry, an introduction to the right people who could elevate her standing. Something that would make her see what he was offering was worth the leap between their worlds. He didn't yet know that some leaps can't be bought, and he didn't know that everything he thought mattered was about to turn to ash 3 weeks later. Preston arrived at the mill to find the gates locked. November frost silvered the ground, and his breath made ghosts in the morning air. He fumbled with his key, confused, then saw the paper nailed to the door. Legal language, dense and cruel. His hands shook as he read, Thomas Ashford, his business partner, had fled in the night, embezzled funds, forged signatures on catastrophic loans, schemes that collapsed overnight, taking everything with them. The bank had foreclosed at dawn. Creditors were coming. Preston had 48 hours to surrender all assets, including his home. Mr. Montgomery. His foreman stood behind him, cap in weathered hands. The workers are asking. Some of them got families. I don't know, Preston said. His voice sounded strange, distant. I don't know anything yet. But by noon, He knew everything. Ashford had been stealing for months, using Preston's name and reputation to leverage loans they could never repay. The whole operation was a shell now, hollow as old corn stalks. Creditors swarmed like crows to carrion. By sunset, the mill was padlocked, and Preston's mansion had a foreclosure notice nailed beside the front door. He had 2 days to gather what he could carry and leave. That evening, he sat his children down in the parlor. Emma's eyes were wide and frightened. Jacob stood rigid, trying to be brave. "We're moving," Preston said, "into a smaller place, just for a while." "How long is a while?" Emma whispered. "I don't know, sweetheart. But we'll be together. That's what matters." 2 days felt like 2 hours. Preston rented a cottage at the edge of town, with the last cash in his pocket. A small place with 2 bedrooms and a wood stove. He didn't know how to operate properly. They moved in under gray skies that threatened snow. The cottage was cold. Emma shivered in her coat. Jacob tried to light the stove and failed, fingers clumsy with unfamiliar work. Preston finally got it burning, but the heat seemed thin and grudging compared to the furnace that had warmed their mansion. That night, they ate beans from a tin pot. Preston had never cooked before. The meal was tasteless and somehow both watery and scorched. "It's all right, Papa," Emma said, though her lips trembled. "I'm not very hungry anyway." Preston looked at his children in the lamplight. Emma huddled under a thin blanket, her breath visible in the cold room. Jacob sat straight-backed and silent, jaw clenched against showing fear. "Will we be all right?" Emma asked. Preston knelt beside her bed. "Yes," he said. "I promise." But his hands shook when he lit the oil lamp, and he wondered if he was lying. The lamp's flame guttered in a draft he couldn't locate, casting nervous shadows on walls that felt too close, too small, too real. Outside, winter was coming, and Preston Montgomery, who'd built an empire on certainty, had no idea what came next. December arrived with cutting winds that found every crack in the cottage walls. Preston learned that his name, once golden, had turned to lead. He visited every business in town, looking for work, partnership, anything. Doors closed. Meetings were canceled. Men who'd sought his favor a month ago now studied their boots when he approached. On Sunday, he took the children to church. They sat in their usual pew, but Preston felt the space around them like a moat. Families who'd invited him to dinners now looked away. Women who'd fawned over Emma now gathered their own daughters close, as if poverty were catching. After the service, Preston stood on the church steps. His former attorney crossed the street to avoid him. A merchant he'd known for years suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. Emma tugged his sleeve. "Papa, why won't anyone talk to us?" Preston had no answer. Jacob stood silent beside him, face hard with understanding beyond his years. The boy saw what Preston was only beginning to grasp, that their friendships had been built on sand, and the tide had gone out that week. Preston's savings dwindled to nothing. He took odd jobs when he could find them, loading freight wagons, mucking out stables, hauling firewood. His hands blistered and bled. His back ached from labor his body didn't know how to do. Every attempt to restart his business failed. No one would lend him capital. His reputation was poison. Thomas Ashford's betrayal had branded Preston as either a fool or an accomplice, and neither label invited trust. By week's end, Preston stood staring at his father's pocket watch, the last valuable thing he owned. Gold casing, engraved with his grandfather's initials. It had passed from father to son for 3 generations. The pawn shop smelled of dust and desperation. $20, the broker said, not looking at Preston's face. $20 for 3 generations of history. Preston's hands shook as he signed the ticket. The money bought firewood and a sack of beans and a small piece of salt pork. It wouldn't last long. That night, Preston knelt by the dying stove. The cottage was cold again. Emma slept fitfully. and Jacob pretended to sleep, though Preston knew he was awake. Listening. Preston wasn't a praying man. Hadn't been since his wife died. But tonight, the words came anyway. Not prayers for his fortune back, not pleas for vindication. Just this, help me know what to do. Help me be enough for them. The stove ticked as metal cooled. Outside, wind moaned around the eaves. Through the frosted window, Preston saw a figure passing on the street, even at this distance. He recognized her walk. Rachel paused, looked toward his cottage. Their eyes met across the darkness. She nodded. Not pity in her expression, not satisfaction. Something else Preston couldn't name. Then she continued on her way, lamp swinging gently at her side. Preston stayed kneeling long after she'd gone, wondering what that look had meant, wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was something in her waiting he'd been too proud to see. He didn't know yet that Rachel had been waiting for exactly this, for him to lose everything except the only thing that mattered. Mid-December brought snow that fell thick and silent, blanketing the town in white. Preston stood in his small yard, chopping wood with an axe he barely knew how to swing. His technique was terrible. The foreman at his old mill could have told him that, but he was learning. Blisters had formed, broken, and started forming again. Each impact sent shockwaves up his arms. Inside, Emma and Jacob ate thin porridge for breakfast. Again. They never complained. But Preston saw how Emma had grown quieter, how Jacob's face had taken on a gaunt, adult look. A knock startled him. The axe slipped, nearly catching his foot. Rachel Brennan stood at his door, snow dusting the shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She held a covered basket, steam rising from beneath the cloth. "Miss Brennan." Preston's voice came out rough. He hadn't spoken to anyone outside his children in days. "Mr. Montgomery, I heard you were having difficulties." She lifted the basket slightly. "I brought bread and some soup. It's still warm." Preston's pride flared hot and immediate. He'd spent a year courting this woman, offering her everything. Now she came with charity, with pity. "That's kind, but we're managing fine." Rachel's eyes gray as winter dawn met his steadily. "Are you behind Preston?" Emma appeared in the doorway. She'd heard voices when she saw the basket. Her face transformed with sudden, desperate hope that broke Preston's heart. "Please, Papa," she whispered. Preston's refusal died in his throat. He stepped aside. Rachel entered, moved through the cottage with quick efficiency. She set the basket on the rough table, uncovered it to reveal a whole loaf of bread, still warm, and a pot of vegetable soup rich with potatoes and carrots and real pieces of meat. Emma and Jacob stared like it was treasure. "Mr. Montgomery," Rachel said quietly, "may we speak outside a moment?" On the porch. Preston's jaw was tight. "Now will you accept my help?" The words came out bitter, edged with all his humiliation. "Now that I'm brought low enough to need it." Rachel studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was gentle and knowing and somehow sad. "No, Mr. Montgomery. Now I'll accept yours." Preston stared at her. "I don't understand." "You've been courting me for a year, offering me mansions and silk. I didn't need those things." She pulled her shawl tighter against the cold. "I needed to know if you could survive without them. If you were a man who could stand when everything fell away, or if you were just the sum of your wealth. And so you waited for me to fail." His voice was harsh. "No, I waited to see who you became when you did." The word struck something deep in Preston, someplace he hadn't known existed until it started aching. "I still don't know who that is," he said quietly. "Then we'll find out together." Rachel met his eyes. "I'm a seamstress, Mr. Montgomery. I know about mending things that are torn, about building something useful from scraps. I can teach you that. If you're willing to learn. Why would you do this? Because I think there's a good man under all that pride. And because your children deserve to see him. Preston looked through the window. Emma and Jacob were eating soup, slowly, savoring each bite. Emma's eyes had tears in them. When he turned back, Rachel was already walking down the path, her lamp a small steady light in the falling snow. "Miss Brennan," he called. She paused, looked back. "Thank you," she nodded. "I'll come again. Wednesday evening, if that suits you. Someone needs to teach you how to keep that stove burning through the night." She was gone before Preston could respond, leaving him standing in snow that was already filling her footprints. Inside, Emma had saved him some soup. It was the best thing Preston had tasted in weeks, warm and rich and real. He didn't understand what was happening. Didn't understand why Rachel would help him. But for the first time since Thomas Ashford had destroyed his life, Preston felt something that wasn't quite hope, but was maybe its distant cousin. Tomorrow he'd haul freight again. Tomorrow he'd fail again to find backing for a new venture. Tomorrow would be hard, but tonight, his children were warm and fed, and Wednesday, Rachel was coming back. January cold settled over the town like a heavy hand, but the cottage stayed warmer now. Rachel came 3 evenings a week, arriving after her own work was done. She brought her sewing basket, took in piecework that she did by Preston's lamplight, her needle flashing silver in the yellow glow. "You're banking the coals wrong," she'd told Preston that first Wednesday. "Here, watch." She'd shown him how to arrange the wood, how to adjust the damper, how to keep heat through the night without wasting fuel. Preston learned. His hands, once soft from counting money, were rough now, but growing steadier. Emma learned to darn socks. Rachel taught her the basic stitches, patient when the girls' attempts came out crooked. Jacob learned to stretch beans and potatoes into stew that could feed them for days. Rachel showed him which scraps of vegetables could flavor broth, which couldn't. And Preston learned that survival was an art form he'd never needed before. "Why did you refuse me?" he asked one evening. The children were asleep. Rachel sewed by lamplight, her fingers never pausing. Preston worked at ledgers for a small merchant who'd hired him to track inventory, paying pennies, but it was something Rachel didn't answer immediately. Her needle dipped and rose, creating neat seams in a shirt she was mending for wages. "I was orphaned at 14. She finally said, "The woman who owned the dress shop in town took me in, taught me to sew. I learned that wealth comes and goes, Mr. Montgomery. But skill stays in your hands. Character stays in your heart. Preston," he said quietly. "You can call me Preston." She glanced up, surprise flickering across her face. Then she smiled. "Preston." Then, "I think I'm starting to understand," he said, "what you meant that day, about our worlds being different. You live in a world where things have real value, where work means something. I lived in a world of abstractions, contracts, and ledgers and social connections that evaporated the moment I couldn't buy them anymore." Rachel set down her sewing. "You're learning. Preston Montgomery. Faster than I expected. I had a good teacher." Something passed between them then, warm and unexpected. Preston felt it like the moment a fire catches, that instant when scattered sparks suddenly find each other and blaze. Rachel picked up her sewing again, but her cheeks had colored slightly. Over the following weeks, a rhythm developed. Rachel would arrive, often bringing ingredients, things from her own garden she'd preserved, or bargains she'd found at market. Together they'd prepare simple meals. Emma would practice her stitches. Jacob would read aloud from his school books. Preston would work on ledgers or accounts, his reputation slowly rebuilding among tradespeople who judged a man by his work, not his past. Word spread in small circles. Montgomery keeps good books. Montgomery's honest about his rates. Montgomery shows up when he says he will. A widow hired him to survey her property. A merchant needed help reorganizing his store. The work was humble, but it was real. Preston was earning enough to keep them fed and warm. One evening, reaching for the same spool of thread, Preston's hand brushed Rachel's. Both paused. Her fingers were warm and calloused from her needle. His were rough from wood splitting and freight hauling. "You're different now, Preston," Rachel said softly. "How? You don't move through the world like you own it anymore. You move through it like you belong to it." Preston thought about that. Through the window, January stars burned cold and clear. Inside, the cottage was warm with lamplight and the smell of bread baking. Emma slept with her mending project clutched to her chest. Jacob was finally acting like a boy again, not a miniature adult carrying too much weight. "I'm starting to see what you saw." Preston said, "When you looked at me all those times I proposed, you saw someone who thought he was offering you everything, when really I didn't have anything real to give." Rachel's hand found his, squeezed gently. "And now I have calluses and an empty pocket and 2 children who depend on me. I have work I do with my hands, and I have—" He paused, meeting her eyes. "I have you, teaching me what matters. You're finally rich enough for me. Preston Montgomery." He didn't understand the words yet, not fully, but he understood the warmth in her voice, the way her hand stayed in his. Outside, January cold ruled the night. Inside, something was growing that no winter could touch. Late February brought rain that turned to sleet, rattling against windows like thrown gravel. Preston stood in the empty warehouse he'd leased, holding papers that meant nothing now. The space echoed around him, cold and hollow. Through the rain-streaked windows, he could see the loading dock where he'd planned to receive shipments. The letter from Denver was polite but final. Contract canceled. The supplier had learned about Thomas Ashford's fraud, about the legal tangles still choking Preston's name. No one wanted to risk association. It had taken Preston 2 months to save enough for the warehouse deposit. Another month to negotiate the Colorado wool contract. He'd imagined restarting his textile business small and honest, building something real this time. Now it was gone. Again? Worse. The creditors from Ashford's schemes had found new angles. A lawyer appeared at the cottage with papers claiming any new income belonged to Preston's old debts. Even this modest restart was threatened. Preston crumpled the letter in his fist. His reflection stared back from the dark window, older than 42, worn by months of struggling, but not broken. Not yet. He locked the warehouse and walked home through the sleet. His coat was thin and offered little protection. The cold seeped into his bones. At the general store, he saw Hiram Crawford, a merchant who'd sometimes hired him for bookkeeping. Preston nodded greeting. Crawford looked away. "Hiram." The merchant stopped, clearly unwilling. "Can't use your services anymore." "Montgomery? May I ask why?" "Folks are talking, saying you must have known what Ashford was doing. Saying once a man gets too big for his britches, he never really comes down to earth." Crawford's voice gained volume, aware of others listening. "You don't know real work. Montgomery. High and mighty fool, that's what you are." Preston stood in the sleet, watching Crawford walk away. Other customers watched, faces showing everything from pity to satisfaction, the weight of their judgment pressed down like the gray sky. At home, Emma had a fever. Nothing serious, Rachel assured him, but the girl needed rest and broth and warmth. Jacob sat beside his sister, reading to her quietly. Rachel found Preston at the window, staring at nothing. "The contract fell through," he said. "The warehouse too. And Crawford just told half the town I'm worthless." Rachel moved to stand beside him. "Are you—" The question was gentle but direct. Preston turned to face her. "I don't know anymore. Rachel, I'm 42 years old. I'm starting over like a boy, and failing even at that. I thought I could rebuild. Thought I could prove I was more than my money. But maybe everyone's right. Maybe I'm just Preston Montgomery. Stop. Rachel's voice had steel in it he'd never heard before. She took his work-roughened hands in hers. Do you know what I see when I look at you? Not the man who courted me with silk scarves. Not the mill owner who thought his money made him worthy. Her gray eyes held his. I see a father who chops wood with blistered hands so his children stay warm. I see a man who works freight docks and keeps honest ledgers and swallows his pride every single day. I see someone learning that real wealth isn't what you own, but what you do when you own nothing. But the warehouse was one chance. There will be others. The desert doesn't bloom overnight. Preston. But it blooms. She pulled him close, and Preston let himself lean into her strength. Through the window, sleet turned back to rain, drumming steadily on the roof. I have nothing to offer you. Preston whispered against her hair. Nothing to offer my children. I'm 42 and starting over, and I keep failing. Rachel pulled back to meet his eyes. Preston, you're just now becoming rich enough for me. He'd heard her say it before, but tonight the words felt different, important. Like a door opening that he'd been too proud to see. I don't understand what you mean. You will, Rachel said. When you're ready, you will. On that night, after Rachel left, Preston sat with his children. Emma's fever had broken. Jacob showed him a complex knot he'd learned for securing loads. Preston thought about Crawford's words, about the canceled contract, about the creditors circling like wolves. Then he thought about Emma's trust, Jacob's pride in his knots, Rachel's steady presence, her needle and thread holding their small household together. Maybe he was failing. Maybe he'd never rebuild his empire. But he hadn't quit. And that, Preston was starting to understand, was its own kind of wealth. Outside, the rain settled into a steady rhythm. Inside, the fire burned warm. Tomorrow would be hard. Tomorrow always was. But tomorrow, he'd try again. Early March dawn came cold but clear. The sky painted gold and pink in the east. Preston stood alone in the yard, watching the sunrise. He'd been awake all night, wrestling with demons. The temptation to quit whispered constantly now. He could send Emma and Jacob to his sister in Kansas City. Could leave this town where his name had become a cautionary tale. Could accept that some failures were too complete to overcome. The door creaked. Small footsteps crossed the porch. Emma slipped her hand into his, her fingers small and cold. She wore the nightgown Rachel had helped her mend, the stitches careful and strong. Papa, are you sad? Preston knelt to her level. Sometimes, sweet pea, sometimes Papa gets tired. Miss Rachel says spring always comes, even when winter seems forever. The simple faith in his daughter's voice broke something in Preston's chest. Or maybe fixed something. He pulled her close, felt her small heart beating against his. Miss Rachel is very wise, he whispered. Are you going to give up? Preston held his daughter at arm's length, looked into eyes that trusted him completely. No, he said. No, I'm not. Jacob appeared in the doorway, sleep rumpled but alert. What's happening? Your father is making a decision. Preston said. We're staying. We're going to make this work. Over breakfast eggs Rachel had brought. Bread they'd baked together, Preston laid out a new plan. If large contracts were blocked by his reputation, he'd start smaller. He knew textiles, knew quality, could judge wool and cotton by touch. He could be a broker connecting rural producers with city manufacturers, taking modest commissions. It's humble work, he told his children. Nothing grand, but it's honest. Honest is good, Jacob said quietly. That afternoon, Preston swallowed the last of his pride. He visited every seamstress in town, asking what fabrics they needed, what suppliers they trusted. Some refused to see him. Others listened warily. But Rachel's friends spoke for him. Montgomery knows his textiles, one said. And Miss Brennan trusts him. Slowly, carefully. Preston began building a network. Rural wool producers who needed city markets. Manufacturers who needed reliable regional sources. Preston positioned himself as the honest middleman, taking fair commissions, delivering what he promised. It was tiny compared to his old business, but it was real. Rachel came that evening, as she did 3 times each week now. She brought sample books from Denver suppliers she knew, contacts in mining towns where seamstresses needed quality fabric. "You understand both sides," she said. "Production and craft, that's valuable. Preston." They worked together at the small table, Rachel sewing, Preston writing letters, planning routes. Emma practiced her stitches. Jacob studied his schoolwork. But Preston caught the boy watching them with something like approval. "We're partners now," Preston said suddenly. Rachel looked up from her needle. "We always were. You just didn't see it yet." Over the following weeks, word spread through a different network than Preston had known before. Not society connections or business elites, but craftspeople and small traders who judged a man by his handshake and his follow-through. Montgomery delivers quality. Montgomery charges fair prices. Montgomery shows up when he says he will. The first commission was tiny $10 for connecting a wool producer with a Denver manufacturer. But it was earned, not inherited or leveraged. Preston held the money like treasure, used it to buy supplies and put away savings. More commissions followed. Not enough for wealth, but enough for security. One evening in late March, the first real thaw arrived. Icicles dripped from the eaves, and the air smelled of wet earth and coming green. Preston repaired the cottage's front step, the wood solid under his hands. He planted a small garden vegetables Rachel had recommended, seeds she'd brought. Emma and Jacob helped, digging in the thawing soil. Rachel arrived to find them mud-splattered and grinning. "Spring," she said simply. That night, they shared supper around the small table. Simple food, stew and bread and early greens from Rachel's preserved stores. But the cottage felt warm and full and right. After the children slept, Preston retrieved his father's pocket watch from the pawn shop. He'd saved enough. Finally, the broker barely looked up as Preston paid the redemption fee. Back at the cottage, Preston held the watch, feeling its familiar weight. Then he went to Jacob's room, where his son pretended to sleep. "Jacob." The boy sat up. "Your grandfather gave this to me," Preston said, holding out the watch. "Now it's yours. Not because it's valuable, but because it reminds us that time is what we have. How we use it is who we are." Jacob took the watch, turned it over in his hands. In the dim light, Preston saw tears on his son's cheeks. "You didn't quit, Papa." "No, I didn't. I'm proud of you." The words settled into Preston's chest, warmer than any fire. He pulled his son close, held him like he hadn't since the boy was small, outside. March wind carried the smell of thaw and earth and beginning. Winter was breaking, and Preston Montgomery, who'd lost everything, discovered he'd found what mattered most. Late April sunshine poured through the cottage windows, warming the worn floorboards. Preston sat at the table with papers spread before him, a contract from Denver. 6 months of honest brokering had built a reputation among the right people. A textile manufacturer who'd heard of Preston's integrity from 3 different sources was offering a partnership for regional distribution. It wasn't his old empire, but it was substantial enough to restore comfortable prosperity, to move his family to a better house, to rejoin society if he wanted. Preston studied the contract, mind working through implications. The terms were fair. The opportunity was real. Everything he'd lost was within reach again. Emma and Jacob were at school. The cottage was quiet except for birdsong outside. A knock came at the door. Rachel, arriving early. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, then saw the papers. "What's this?" Preston explained the offer. Rachel listened carefully, her seamstress eyes seeing between the lines of legalese. "It's a good opportunity. she said when he finished. It is. Preston hesitated. Rachel, I've recovered. I'm back to being somebody again, at least by the town's reckoning. He met her eyes. Will you marry me now? The words hung between them. Rachel sat across from him, folded her hands on the table. Preston Montgomery, answer me honestly. Do you want this partnership because it's the right business decision? Or because you think it makes you worthy of me? The question hit like cold water. Preston opened his mouth to answer, then stopped, looked at his work-roughened hands, at the cottage that had become home, through the window at the garden beginning to sprout green. 6 months ago, he'd have needed this contract, desperately needed it to prove he could recover, that he was still the man he'd been, that he deserved Rachel's hand. But now, 6 months ago, Preston said slowly, I'd have wanted it to prove myself, to show you and the town and maybe mostly myself that I could get back what I'd lost. He met Rachel's eyes. Today, I want it because it's good work that serves people fairly, because I can do it honestly and well, because it fits who I've become. And who is that? Preston considered. Someone who knows that worth isn't what you own. Someone who understands that the hardest work is often the most important. Someone who's learned that real wealth is measured in calluses and character, not coins. He paused. I'm the same man either way, Rachel, with or without this contract. Rachel's face transformed with a smile that lit the whole room. Then yes, Preston, I'll marry you. Preston stared at her, just like that, just like that. Rachel reached across the table, took his hands. You finally understand what I've been waiting for you to learn. I never wanted your money. I wanted to know if you could be whole without it. If you could stand when everything fell away and discover you were still standing on something solid. I lost everything, Preston said, voice rough. No. You lost everything except what made you valuable. Rachel squeezed his hands. You have children who respect you more now than when you had a mansion. You have honest work that serves people fairly. You have calluses from labor and character built through suffering. You have you. Preston finished. You always could have had me, Preston. You just had to become rich enough first. I don't understand. I have less now than when I started courting you. Rachel stood, moved around the table, lifted his hands to examine the calluses and scars. These hands, she said softly, have built something real, have fed children through winter, have learned what matters and what doesn't. She looked up at him. You're finally rich enough for me, Preston Montgomery. You always were. You just had to lose everything to find it. Preston pulled her close, buried his face in her hair. She smelled of lavender and honest work. I love you, he whispered, not because you saved us, not because you taught me, but because you saw something in me worth waiting for, even when I couldn't see it myself. I know, Rachel said simply. I've known for months. They stood together in the sunshine, the cottage warm around them, the contract forgotten on the table. Preston would sign it later, would build his modest business, would provide comfortable security for his family, but not because he needed it to prove his worth. Because it was good work, done by good hands, in service of people who deserved fair dealing. And that, finally, was enough. Rachel pulled back, eyes shining. Spring wedding. Yes, Preston said. Yes? Through the window. April sunshine touched the garden where green shoots pushed toward light. The world was full of growing things, of second chances, of worth that couldn't be bought or sold, only earned. And Preston Montgomery, who'd been bankrupt 6 months ago, discovered he was the richest man he knew. Early May sunshine warmed the church steps where Preston stood in his work suit, the one Rachel had helped him mend. It fit him better now than his expensive tailored clothes ever had. The patches at the elbows were Rachel's careful work, nearly invisible, unless you knew to look for them. But Preston liked that they were there. Reminders that broken things could be made whole. Inside, Emma fussed with her flower basket, her face glowing with joy. Jacob stood straight in his Sunday coat, Preston's grandfather's watch chain visible at his vest. "You ready, Papa?" Jacob asked. Preston nodded. "More than I've ever been." The church was full but different from the congregations Preston remembered from his wealthy days. Seamstresses and merchants sat beside freight workers and farmers. Rachel's friends filled the pews people who judged character, not bank accounts. Some of society's elite were notably absent. Preston didn't care. The music began. Emma scattered petals down the aisle, each step careful and proud. Then Rachel appeared. She wore a dress she'd sewn herself, simple cotton in cream. But the cut was perfect. The seams invisible. The whole creation speaking of skill and care. Her hair was pinned with wildflowers Emma had picked that morning. She carried no elaborate bouquet, just a small bundle of early roses from her garden. She was the most beautiful thing Preston had ever seen. Rachel walked alone, needing no one to give her away. She'd always belonged to herself. That was part of why Preston loved her, at the altar. She took his hands. The minister spoke words about partnership and vows, but Preston barely heard. He was lost in Rachel's gray eyes, seeing everything they'd been through together reflected there. "I, Preston Montgomery, take you, Rachel Brennan." The vows were traditional, but the meaning behind them was earned through cold nights and hard lessons and 6 months of discovering what mattered. When the minister pronounced them married, Rachel leaned close and whispered, "Welcome home, husband." The reception was held in the churchyard. Simple food dishes the congregation had brought. Nothing fancy, but everything made with care. Children ran between tables. Men talked crops and weather. Women admired Rachel's dress and asked about the stitching. Preston stood with his arm around his wife watching Emma teach younger girls her embroidery. Stitches. Jacob was showing some boys his grandfather's watch, explaining its history with quiet pride. "Are you happy?" Rachel asked. Preston considered the question seriously. He thought about the mansion he'd lost, the empire that had crumbled, the year of struggle and humiliation and slow rebuilding. "Yes," he said, "happier than I knew how to be before. Because of the Denver contract. No." Preston turned to face her fully. "I signed that contract yesterday, and you want to know what I felt? Satisfied, pleased, but not happy." "Not like this. Then what makes you happy?" Preston looked around the churchyard. Emma learning to create something with her hands. Jacob becoming a young man I'm proud of. Honest work that serves people fairly. A partner who sees me clear and loves me anyway. He touched Rachel's face gently. Right now, this makes me happy." Rachel smiled. The smile he'd first seen a year ago when he'd made his clumsy proposals. Now he understood what that smile meant: patience and wisdom and love that waited for readiness, not riches. The afternoon faded toward evening. Guests began departing. Emma and Jacob rode ahead in a neighbor's wagon, excited to return to the cottage, their cottage now, all 4 of them together. Preston and Rachel walked slowly through the spring twilight. The air smelled of apple blossoms and warm earth. Somewhere a meadowlark sang its liquid evening song. "You kept your cottage," Preston said. "The one you had before." "I did. Sold most of the furniture, but kept the cottage itself." "Why?" Rachel looked at him. "Because it was mine, built by my own work, paid for with my own wages. I wanted to remember that I could always take care of myself." Preston understood. "Will you keep it still?" "I think so. Maybe we'll use it for storage. Or maybe someday it'll be a place for Emma when she's grown. Or Jacob." Rachel squeezed his hand. "I don't need to sell it anymore. I'm not giving up my independence to marry you, Preston. I'm choosing to share it. That's the difference. Isn't it what you tried to tell me all along?" "Yes." They reached the cottage as twilight deepened to dusk. Inside, Lamps were lit. Preston could see Emma and Jacob through the window, setting the table for supper, on the doorstep. Rachel turned to Preston. "We have everything we need," she said softly. Preston looked at the modest cottage with its mended step and small garden, thought about his humble business and honest work, his children who'd learned that character mattered more than coins, his wife who'd waited a year and 6 months for him to understand what she'd always known. "Yes," he said, "we do." They entered together, and Rachel hung her shawl on the peg beside Preston's worn coat. Emma had made stew the recipe Rachel had taught her, simple but nourishing. Jacob set out bread he'd bought from Rachel's friend who ran the bakery. They sat around the table, the 4 of them, and Preston felt something settle deep in his chest. Peace. Belonging, home. Later. After the children slept, Preston and Rachel sat by the window. Her sewing basket was beside her chair, always would be. That careful work that was part of who she was. His ledger books were stacked nearby, evidence of honest business built on character. "I spent a year trying to win you with wealth," Preston said into the comfortable quiet. "It took losing everything to learn what you always knew. And what's that? That worth isn't what you own, but who you are when you own nothing." Preston pulled her close. "Thank you for waiting. Thank you for becoming someone worth waiting for." Through the window, May stars brightened in the darkening sky. The world was settling into night. But inside the cottage, lamplight glowed warm and steady. Rachel picked up her sewing. Preston opened his ledger, reviewing accounts for tomorrow's work. The room was quiet except for the scratch of his pen and the whisper of her needle through fabric. Simple sounds, honest sounds. The sounds of a life built on work and character and love that had waited for readiness. Outside, the garden grew in darkness, sending down roots and reaching toward light. And inside, Preston Montgomery discovered what he'd been searching for all along. Not the wealth he'd lost, but the wealth he'd found by losing it: home.